is the MD of Red Cap Investment Private Limited. He's specializing in renewable energy and energy efficiency. Mark is a certified energy manager, previous CEO of CEF. He's also been in the Energy Development Corporation as a director, and also been involved with the Darlington Wind Farm. I would also like to introduce my learned sister. She's a lawyer, Happy Masondo, director at Worksman Attorneys. She's LLB and LLM. She's a commercial law expert. She has specialized in contractual and regulatory matters related to the mining, construction industry, power sector, and technology sector. She has experience in drafting agreements, power purchase agreements, connection, transmission and distribution agreements, and also complex construction agreements and projects. Thomas is the CEO of Synergy. He's an engineer with an MBA and has vast experience in mining. He's the current chairman of the South African Association of Independent Power Producers. Our topic for the day is renewable energy in Africa. I think the key issues for discussion this afternoon is to look at what can be done to ensure that appropriate renewable technologies are selected and delivered to their full potential across Africa. I think the statistics which we had this morning, we remain poor in terms of energy poverty. We have vast resources, both renewable and non-renewable resources of energy, which we need to exploit. The issue is what's happening. Why are we not able to exploit these resources such that we have sufficient energy for our continent? My panelists are going to ponder the key questions, and these are the importance of the renewable energy sources for Africa's development, barriers to adoption of the renewable energy in Africa, policy and legal limits, including the regulatory issues, and the costs of renewable technologies and accessing the grid. But I would like to ask Mark to start the ball rolling and give us his thoughts on the issues. Mark?
Thanks, Gloria. Just before we started, Gloria was saying to me, why was nothing happening in renewable energy? And Tommy and myself were pointing out that in the last few months we've had the first groundbreaking ceremonies of various wind farms and solar farms in South Africa, at least. So a lot is happening, but Tommy then rightfully pointed out that it's taken us a very long time to get there. So the points that we were asked to ponder today, one of the key ones has been, and it was mentioned in the previous session, the whole issue of policy and legal limitations. The reason there have been essentially eight wind farm groundbreakings and I forget the solar number, 18 solar groundbreakings is that South African government finally has a policy framework that works for renewable energy. Like anything in life, policies can always be improved, but we now have a policy framework where people are willing to invest, and there's now a serious investment happening in our country. So we are at the start of this, and in terms of the question of the importance of renewable energy sources for Africa's development, most of the developers have made, or all the developers in South Africa have made promises of how their projects will obviously produce power, but assist in uplifting local communities. So essentially the question of what can renewables do for Africa's development is, for me, not just specifically about the power it will generate, that's sorely needed, it's also how bringing IPPs into a market can also do some significant upliftment.
Just to the point about the importance of renewable energy sources for Africa's development, I think there's no doubt that it's critical. I think there's no doubt that we have to harness what we can, especially in an environment, in the South African context in particular, where you're running out of capacity. I know that there's a retort that says, well, actually, you're not running out of capacity because you build in Medupi and Kusile, as the moderator was saying. But you have an integrated resource plan that contemplates that at minimum, more than 3,000 megawatts have to come from alternative forms of energy. So there's an acknowledgement, at least in the policy formulation and now in the policy implementation, that alternative forms of energy are critical to the development of South Africa. The point about the barriers to adoption of renewable energy in Africa, in the main, you could refer to policy limitations, which is another point that's mentioned later on in what we need to consider and answer to. But it can be done, and we see it in the integrated resource plan that South Africa has adopted, and in fact is being used currently to have these projects that are going on and groundbreaking of those wind and PV plants that have happened following financial close recently for round one of the project. So barriers are there, and I think they may have come about as a result of legislation that didn't contemplate that one day we would be in this space where we are talking about alternative forms of energy, and we are not exclusively reliant on electricity and power as we've conventionally known it in the past. On the cost of renewable technologies, there is a sense at which I suppose it becomes a red herring to say it's too expensive, therefore it can't be done. But we've seen in the last several months during the program that the DOE is managing, the prices go down rapidly. They've gone down rapidly from round one to the point where we are now at round three. Prices have gone down considerably. So we shouldn't allow those types of red herrings to stop us from doing what is right.
I think from my side, if you look at the principles of economics, capital is definitely following certainty. And I think that's why we struggled to get to a space in South Africa specifically where we could make investments in renewable energy. And it goes back as long as, let's say, 10 years in history where there was a white paper from the government, but the government not following through on its own policy. And it took some time to get there, and we must commend the government for actually designing a great program where there's a lot of certainty in, because that then led to this massive competition in the market from developers and IPPs that led to the prices lowering as they do, because that's being driven by the competition. So just to look at the South African example, and I'll get to Africa now, is in South Africa, policy certainty and good competition in a very well-designed process led to tariffs dropping rapidly from an IPP or renewable point of view. I think the lesson learned from that is let's get certainty in policy across the region as soon as possible, because that will release investors from that fear. The second part that I think is a barrier to entry is access to the grid, and specifically in South Africa that was a massive issue. I think it's being resolved as we speak, but there's still a lot of bureaucracy in the processes, long timelines, where you can build a renewable energy site, let's say in 6 to 9 months, maximum 12 months. Grid connection of that same facility takes between 24 and 35 months, which again is a massive challenge to any investor. So we need to get certainty about grid access sooner than later across the continent. I think a lack of investment in the grid, in the backbone, in the whole SADC region and the whole of Africa is a massive challenge. And if we can get that right in a public-private partnership maybe, that could lead to a lot of certainty in that area. If you look at the SAP day-aid market and the trades that happen there. A lot of those trades, there's a demand for the energy, but because of grid issues, those energy can't be traded. So there's obviously an area of investment that needs to happen there, and I think if there can be a program where private enterprise can come into that and stimulate investment in grid and transmission in the region, it will go a massive way. The third thing I think that's a challenge in the renewable energy is the typical principle of project finance, where, and I say it with all due respect, Happy, that in the early stages of these developments, the only people that's really making money are the lawyers and the investment bankers. The challenges in terms of project finance is massive, and there's a small market of bankers in the region, and there's a massive amount of projects. So there's a supply and demand issue there, and then the cost of project finance, the issues around governances and the complexities of these deals are amazing. At the same time, Europe and the US is sitting on stashes of cash that they actually want to invest and don't invest because of risk perception. And I think that's something we can do as Africans, because if you go and talk to anybody in the US or in Europe about Africa, they see it as this big black part in the world. And whether you talk about Nigeria, South Africa, Namibia or Egypt, they're not like sure where that is. If we can, as Africans, get together and market the investment destination of Africa better, because the risk return here is still amazing. I mean, if you look at overseas pension funds, if they can get 12-13% dollar returns at massively de-risked projects, why not? But that's not being marketed properly. So the access to the right capital to invest in Africa, good quality, cheap capital without all these complex deals will go a long way in terms of unlocking renewable energy. And that capital can be used in infrastructure investment in terms of transmission and also in terms of projects. And for me, those are the three areas that we need to unlock.
The issue of grid and non-grid solutions. I think when we had the presentations this morning, a lot of it is related to the fact that there's a lot of energy poverty, but mostly concentrated in the rural areas. And one of the ways which to address that poverty is to come up with mini grids systems. Do you think if this round of, especially on the South African procurement system, of renewable systems was purely meant for the rural communities, would it have been financeable?
I don't think it would be financeable unless there's guarantees coming from a government to say, but we will stand behind the buyers. But if you're in a rural community that needs to be electrified and you put up a small mini grid or some grid and you put up, let's say, a 50 megawatt solar farm, no bank is going to give you any money for that unless somebody stands behind the power purchase agreement or the offtake. And that's my earlier point, is we need to look at different ways of funding these things, because project finance is not the be-all and the end-all in terms of funding infrastructure. The challenge is simply that you need to be able to recoup your investment, and project finance, the banks gives most of the finance, and they want that covered. So the challenge is in creating alternative funding structures, and we mustn't underestimate the amazing market that Africa is, and you can just see it in the cellular telephone industry, is that there's many more cell phones in Africa than there's people, and it's all affordable. And the same with electricity. We can do that, but we need to look at different mechanisms of funding it.
South Africa is just going through our utilities asking for a price increase, and there was a very telling photo in one of our daily newspapers of someone with a placard saying, essentially, increase the cost of electricity, you're forcing us to cook with paraffin, which is the whole question of mini grids and distributed power. Obviously, distributed power makes a lot of sense. Why go and produce power in the Western Cape and send it to the Eastern Cape? You don't have to be an engineer to work that out. The question of rural and poor and access to electricity, I mean, often people forget that it's still a question of, if it's expensive, it doesn't matter. If you're giving people access to it, they won't use it. And Eskom for a time was very good, and I still think is good, at reaching our rural communities, but they're not using the electricity that they have access to. It's too expensive. So I don't think renewables or any other technology that can be distributed, or mini grid, whatever it is, provides the panacea that most people like of green and help the poor. There's some fundamental issues of pricing of electricity, etc., and access to energy that have to be dealt with. I don't think renewables is the answer.
Yep. The issue of the various forms of renewable, I would like to attest to the fact that in Zimbabwe we do have a small IPP. It uses forest waste. It's 0.5 megawatt, 500 kilowatts. It's operational. It was actually constructed by one of the timber companies, and they were using their own waste to generate their own electricity, and it has worked out quite well. The issue which I would like to share from there is that it's one of the projects which were funded under the EU fund, and the issue of financing at times comes into play. And we also do have a couple of small macro hydro systems, 24 kilowatts, 25 kilowatts, which have come up in rural communities with, but most of those have come from donor funding. I think they're being done by practical action now. So we do have those, and I think one of the panelists who was supposed to be here was going to share with you some of the experiences we have had with solar mini grids, which have been rolled out into a lot of small villages in Zimbabwe, about 100 villages and schools, small clinics have benefited from those. Obviously, there are some small problems which are related to such systems, and one of the issues is the fact that the storage part is expensive and it has to be changed, especially with solar systems, quite often. And some of them is that because of the communities they serve, they're not sustainable. We need to look at how best these systems become sustainable, such that the technologies can be localized in one form or the other, because like some of the batteries which they used for the 100 systems, they came from Italy, they packed up, and then people start believing that these systems really don't work. They're just a temporal solution whilst waiting for the grid. So at the end of the day, when we talk about some of these renewable energy solutions, especially for small communities where we want to use them as mini grids, you want to look at them coming in as a combination of solutions. Solar may be combined with your biomass system, which then helps that during the times when the sun is off, then they are burning that invasive bush which Namibia wants to get rid of. Or they come in with some biomass or some biogas system which then uses a small turbine to generate electricity. So those are some of the issues which I think we should look at. I realize that most of the systems we are talking about now are really related to large systems feeding into the grid. But we are talking about energy poverty, where we have most of our countries with less than 10% rural electrification. How do we address those issues? I would like some of the people from from the floor to sort of address some of those issues, share with us some of those experiences, so that as we live here, we are really looking at how do we resolve the issue of renewable energy being a possible solution to solving our energy poverty. Any takers?
Kobus Morgan from PowerTech, South African-based company. My question is of a technical nature, and I think the two successful bidding companies might be able to answer this one. From a distribution engineer's point of view, the concern is always that if you have a variable or unpredictable source of power, it has a system operating impact. What were the concerns or objectives, or objections from Eskom or the municipalities when you made your presentations for this bid round? And if there were any concerns or objections, how were these overcome? Thank you.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if there are actually two parts to the question. One could be quality of supply, and is there a voltage variance going in? And the other is, can you predict it? In terms of the first, we have to comply with the South African grid codes. So it wasn't a discussion. It was, you will comply with the grid codes, and that's essentially part of our, our PPA. So you have to. So then it's the second part of the variability. I mean, we never, the municipality we're engaging with does not have its own electricity department. They rely on Eskom. They had no concerns about any variability, and in our PPAs we have to be predicting 72, 48, 24 hours in advance that Eskom can plan. So it's a boring answer to the question, because there were no concerns about that. I guess as my final point is on the carbon credit side, our project is registered for carbon credits. I now question why we went through that whole process, because I don't know if anyone knows what the spot price is today for CERs, but it's not worth what the effort we went through. I mean, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but so I'd hazard a guess most of the round one, possibly round two, there was the urgency to get them registered by, into the system by the end of 2012. They're there, but they're not really, you can't rely on them as a funder, and the proof now is that, thank God we didn't rely on them, because they're not really worth that much, and there's a question on what's going to happen in the new regime. So it was here. There was a big bang in South Africa, I think, with carbon credits, and now you hear very little, and I think it's a factor of the international market.
And I can just reiterate what Mark said, is two sides of the coin of the grid connection is Eskom or the municipality has to take your power. And they probably had some deliberations during the design of the process, but we have to comply to the grid code, and that's it. So there's not many issues there. I think in practice, that's going to become more problematic in terms of the systems operator managing that over time. As you can think in 20 years from now, when Mpumalanga is now a massive exporter of power, it will become an importer of power. And if the wind is blowing in the Western Cape, it's going to become an exporter of power in the afternoons and an importer of power in the morning. So it is going to become more complex. I think in carbon credits, I mean, we registered our projects as well. Man, that's a hell of a lot of work for almost nothing. And yeah, it's a learning. I mean, maybe the world changes again and carbon credits go to 15 euros a ton again. But I mean, I don't think it's €1 at this stage.
There was a question which I got from one of the conferences I attended, which had to do with that the honeymoon is over for renewable. At one time, if you looked at Europe, there were lots of systems coming up, and there were lots of huge subsidies which were provided for by governments. But I would like to pose a question to all of us to say, can we see seriously renewable energy being the solutions to our African energy poverty? I'm looking at us addressing the issue of where there's no access. how do we use those to look at access? Because most of our conversation now and what we have been discussing is procurement, which the South African government has done to bring in energy, renewable energy into the energy mix, where you still find that the coal remains the main baseload provider and nuclear, and then renewable energy is just coming in to fill up a small percentage of that. For some of the people here, I can see my brother from Namibia. Do we have others who can share their experiences and how they see that renewable energy being used to address the rural communities and being a solution to that? Any takers from?
Yes, from my side in conclusion, I think what we must understand regarding development is that development is normally driven by government policy. And so governments in Africa should come forward and say, this is how we want to develop our country. And part of that is education, and part of that is electrification, so that people can learn. And so it's very important to ensure that there is electricity in the rural areas. And it's like being said, is the opportunity cost of not having electricity is massive. And therefore, you can see in Africa where there's no access to grid electricity, the alternative is diesel or petrol or something like that. Comes at R4.50 to R5.50 per kilowatt hour, which is massive. But people do that because they need electricity. So in that environment, any other technology can compete massively. So that whole thing is just driven by policy, by a government deciding to uplift its own people and making sure they get access to electricity.
The question you were posing about whether or not the energy poverty can be resolved in Africa, and to the point about policy and the limitations of policies, I think we should commend the DOE for having been able to harness all the energy, pardon the pun, in getting everybody to contribute to the integrated resource plan, and in it targeting that 42% of the power in the future in South Africa would come from renewable energy sources. The difficulty is whether or not we are able to implement those policies quick enough to meet the opportunities that arise. But I don't think there is a feeling, at least in policymakers, that it shouldn't be so. I think their hearts are in the right places. It's just the speed at which they release the pulse and try to make sure that they meet the policy imperatives or the policy aspirations.
My concluding remarks are that renewable energy in Africa, I do find we tend to forget that we're talking about a plethora of African states that all have different issues. So South Africa has a well-distributed grid infrastructure. Different solutions for rural electrification in South Africa than in areas where you have to go 600 kilometers. But we must always be careful of getting fixated on there's a solution, it was said earlier, let's not replicate European solutions, let's look at African. You have to look at specific for your country, because it depends on what resources you have at your disposal. If you have lots of coal, maybe that should factor in as part of your energy mix. If you don't have any, then consider solar. So the first point is the solution has to be country specific and look at your fundamentals. My final point would be, I still think there is no panacea, there's no silver bullet. The examples made of renewable energy and what it could do for rural areas, for me that's all great in theory, but until storage becomes totally affordable, that inevitable decision of, people aren't stupid. If it's cheaper to generate electricity with PV with storage, you'll stop buying diesel in the diesel generator. It's just simple economics. But we're not there yet. So if we get there in the next 5 to 10 years, I think renewables can be an amazing solution for off-grid. But until that stage, I think it's a long way off for renewables to be the solution or the panacea.